So thank you again. Good morning and hello. We're so glad to have you with us for today's training on the Equal Access Rule and cultural competency in serving members of the LGBTQIA+ community. My name is Monica. I'm joined by my esteemed co-colleague, Eli Hamilton, and we are going to be presenting this training on behalf of Home Base. You may already be familiar with us, but just in case, Home Base is a technical assistance and training provider that works with housing and homeless service providers in Santa Clara County. We do provide a number of trainings throughout the year, including a longer version of this training, a 6-hour version that really gets into detail on terminology and concepts. Today's training is really a quick introduction to some of these terminologies and concepts. So we're very excited to have you with us, and we look forward to inviting you to the longer in-depth training as well. So on the next slide, I'm sure that you're all very familiar by now, but a couple of quick technical notes now that folks have joined us from the waiting room. As I mentioned, we do have closed captioning available, and that's at the bottom of your screen with an icon that has 2 C's and says live transcript. We have muted everyone on entry to minimize background noise so that folks can hear us. But we will pause periodically, and you're very welcome to unmute yourself or utilize the chat to ask any questions or comments. We're going to monitor the chat throughout and pause periodically to address questions or check for understanding. We are recording this training, but the chat will not be recorded. And we're going to cover a lot in this next 2 hours, so we will be sure to send out the slides as well as a post-training survey afterwards. We're so excited to have so many folks joining us this morning, and we'd love to pause to get to know who all is here. So if you could please introduce yourself in the chat, let us know your name, your role, and maybe something that made you smile recently. Yes, having a day off is definitely reason to smile. Dogs and pets are amazing. Outside time, baby time, beaches. That's excellent. Hugs are amazing. So glad folks are getting to have some outside time and some time with loved ones as well. And please do keep them coming. This is wonderful. We really appreciate starting this day and this week with sharing smiles with all of you. And so as we look forward to our time together today, as I mentioned, we're going to be covering a number of topics. We are going to talk about the Equal Access Rule, what it is and what it means for all of you. We're also going to talk about SOGI 101 and cultural competency for serving members of the LGBTQIA+ community. We are going to be introducing a number of acronyms and terms throughout this training, and we will do our best to pause to define them as we use them. So I just used 2 big ones just now. So the first one is SOGI, and that stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And we're going to talk about each of those in turn. And we're also going to talk about cultural competency with working with and for members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And that's an acronym commonly used to refer to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and/or asexual individuals and communities. You may have heard other versions of this acronym. This is the version that we're going to be using to try to be more inclusive. And we will certainly be introducing additional terminology as we go. Recognizing that this is going to be a lot of learning in a short period of time, and the best way to learn is really to practice. We are going to save time at the end of our training to put some of these lessons into practice together. As I mentioned, this is a 2-hour training. We're going to plan to have a 5-minute break at around the middle point. And we definitely appreciate how very busy you all are. And we're so glad to have you with us. Understanding that, Slack and phone and email never stops. We want to invite you as much as possible to be present with us for these next 2 hours. If there's anything that we can do to help you to protect this time, please feel free to send us a direct message in the chat. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Eli to get us started.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I'm going to pass the participant list over to you. We're still having a couple people popping into the waiting room. So we are going to start by talking about some concepts and some language because related to sexual orientation and gender identity, gender expression, because your understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity has a huge impact on the ability to provide welcoming, supportive, safe services for members of the LGBTQIA+ community, and on the ability of all of our clients to access services equally and in a safe way. We're going to be talking a lot about best practice language and about how our language can impact the people that we're talking to and about and who we're providing services for. We're starting with this SOGI 101 and cultural competency so that you have a foundation to talk about and engage with the actual compliance requirements in the equal access rule. So we're gonna get there, but we want to build up for those of you for whom these are new concepts, the skills to talk and to start practicing this best practice language. So the first thing, the first concept we want to introduce is in the other slide deck. Yep, I knew this. Here we go. One moment. There we go. So the first concept we want to start with is just the idea that language and the impact of words can be really contextual. Language changes over time, and also the tone, the context, who else is in the room can all impact the meaning and also the context and the connotations and the impact of the language that we use. So because of that, I want to really ground us in the idea of continual learning, right? We are all going to make mistakes in everything that we do. It's human. We're not perfect. We're not machines. And those mistakes are okay, right? I want to make sure that we can let go of any fear or shame as much as possible of making mistakes. But at the same time, it's also really important to own the when we have said something that wasn't the best thing to say and it's hurt someone, right? It's important to recognize that and to own the impact of our language and our actions, regardless of what our intention was, because we can hurt someone or make them feel uncomfortable, even with the best of intentions, right? And so acknowledging that and then going back to, okay, so now I'm going to practice. I'm going to practice the thing that I want to do differently next time, right? And engage in that continual process of learning. So to really bring the concept of the changing of language and the flexibility of language home, I'm going to start with an example, the word queer. The word queer has been in the English vocabulary for a long, long time, since the 1500s, as a word that means different, odd, weird, unusual, right? As mostly an adjective, right? That's a queer bucket you have there. It looks weird. And it started being used in more modern times to as a noun and to describe people who are members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And it was initially used pejoratively. It was used to say, "Oh, you're weird, you're unusual, you're not normal." Now, this word can be viewed as an in-group and out-group word, meaning that there are a lot of members of the LGBTQIA+ community who have embraced and used the word queer to describe themselves as an aspect of their identity, reclaiming this word, embracing what, the joyful aspects of being different, of being outside of the norm. And so when a person uses the word queer to describe themselves or in their friend group or in their community, that can be really positive. At the same time, the word queer is also still used in pejorative ways. And so if someone outside of that person's community or friend group or comfort zone uses the word queer, that can feel, in some cases, very attacking, very othering, right? And uncomfortable. And so it's a really good example of how the context of words is important and also how words change over time. Queer is now also used as an adjective, as a noun, and also as a verb, right? We can queer something. We can twist it a little bit, look at it from a different perspective, and bring it outside of the norm, right? So language is flexible. And this is actually an example of a best practice, not just for the word queer, but for all of the words that people use to identify themselves. You never want to assume that someone uses a particular word. You don't want to assume that based on someone's appearance or even based on their behavior, the relationships that they're in, or other words they use to identify themselves, that, okay, so that makes them this, that puts them in this bucket, right? Because language is very context specific. And so what we want to encourage, and what is the best practice, is use the words that the person uses to talk about themselves. If you don't know, you can, and it's necessary for you to have a word, you can ask, you can have a conversation with that person. And sometimes there is no language, sometimes there are no words, and it's our responsibility to find a way to have conversations and to talk in those gray areas without really clear, easy language. But again, this is something that is a continual learning process to get comfortable with. The next, and feel free to put questions in the chat. I will pause for questions periodically, but for time, I'm not going to be pausing after every slide, but absolutely throw your questions in the chat. So next, we want to introduce just some basic concepts about human identity and human relationships and the societies that we live in. Monica previewed these. So the acronym SOGI stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Gender Expression. The concepts of sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression are not specific to the LGBTQIA+ community. Everybody has a sexual orientation. Every human being in our society has a gender identity, and we all express gender. So these are just basic concepts we're going to go over as a foundation for then talking about some language that's specific to LGBTQIA+ folks. And we're going to do this using the gender unicorn, which is a delightful little graphic here and represents these aspects of identity. So first, in our gender unicorn, gender identity is up here. It's represented by this lovely rainbow, and it lives in the gender unicorn's mind and brain, right? In this graph, at least. Gender expression is represented by these green dots. It is a holistic sort of expression from all parts of this unicorn's physical appearance. And then we have sex assigned at birth, which lives in this lovely little DNA strand down here, right? And we'll talk about why that's located there in a bit. And then we have two aspects of sexual orientation, physical attraction and emotional attraction. And they live up here in the little gender unicorn's heart. So we're going to talk about each of these pieces, starting with sex assigned at birth. At least in most places that babies are born on Earth at this moment, babies are assigned a sex at birth, typically, and certainly in our social context here in America. And when a baby is born, what happens? The doctor looks at the baby and says, this baby is female or this baby is male. Sometimes the doctor has to look at other stuff, right? But primarily for the majority of babies, this determination is made purely on a visual assessment based on external genitalia. But we know that there's a lot more that goes into someone's physiological sex characteristics, like internal genitalia, gonads, chromosomes, hormones. There's a lot of different pieces. And we'll talk later about how all those different pieces don't necessarily have to line up, right? But just to understand that when we say sex assigned at birth, what we're talking about is, when you had that first interaction with a doctor and the doctor said, this is a little female baby or a little male baby, or a little intersex baby. And that's what we're talking about. It's about physiological characteristics. And then let's go back up to gender identity. Gender identity is different from sex assigned at birth. And gender identity, instead of being related to physiological characteristics, is related to an internal sense of a person's gender. That's why it's located in the brain of the gender unicorn. This is a self-identification and an internal sense of a gender, the connection with gender. What do we mean when we say gender expression then, right? We have a gender identity, but what is our gender expression? Gender expression is how we communicate gender to the world. That can be done through clothing, through mannerisms, through makeup or a lack of makeup, through whatever else is gendered in our society. And what is gendered changes, right? So in some parts of the world and in some periods in history, the wearing of a dress or a skirt type garment has been gendered female, and in some places and times it's been gendered male, and in some places and times it has had no particular gender, right? So that expression of gender is really based on what do the things I'm doing, the way I walk, the way I talk, how is that going to be read and interpreted by people in my particular culture and environment? And finally, we have these two aspects of orientation and attraction. And this graphic, I think, very nicely separates physical attraction and emotional attraction, right? Because we can be physically attracted to a person, but maybe not necessarily want to be in a romantic relationship with them, and vice versa. And in the same way, patterns of physical attraction and emotional attraction don't necessarily have to align, right? Not many humans have patterns of physical attraction that don't align with their patterns of emotional attraction. When we talk about sexual orientation, we're generally talking about that. We're talking about patterns of attraction. We're not talking about who is that person in a relationship with right now, or who is that person typically sleeping with right now. We're talking about what is the overall pattern of attraction? What is, in this person's experience, who are they typically, who do they experience attraction for in different ways? And so that behavior is a distinct thing from someone's sexual orientation that they might describe in terms of their feelings. It's interestingly, this patterns of attraction typically and often develop in human children around 6 to 12, in that range. So when you think about like your patterns of attraction, you might think back to, when was my first crush, right? And those childhood crushes where it's like, oh, I want to be around that person all the time. I get butterflies when that person comes along. So take a moment and try to think back. How old were you when you first had your first, what you would call a crush, your first crushing on someone? You don't have to share in the chat, but just think back. I think for me, I was probably around 7. And it was very much like that, just the butterflies, you know. And I think that's it's been really interesting for me to think about those patterns of attraction being something that just sort of, they live in your heart and they can change, but it's a really personal thing that actually starts to develop when we're quite young. I want to pause here and ask, are there any clarifying questions that folks have about these concepts before we move on to some specific identities? Okay, excellent. Well, we're going to move on, and we're gonna go from thinking about these aspects of human identity as things we all have, to thinking about and learning about excuse me, what are some specific identities and specific experiences that we want to start, being able to talk about. And we want to encourage you to really live in a space of full spectrum thinking, right? It's pretty typical and very easy for, just for ease or for other, reasons, social reasons, to get into a binary mode of thinking, right? Things are black or white, or even things are either green or blue, right? And then think that these are clear categories. But really, when it comes to our experience of things in the natural world, our experience of human things and human identities, there's so much more complexity there, right? There aren't rigid categories. There aren't boxes. Those are things that we create to make our complex world more digestible, more understandable. But in reality, there are full spectrums of color and full spectrums of identity and experience that are incredibly nuanced. And so we want to live in this full spectrum thinking about the world, and expect things to be a little bit gray, expect things to be not quite so neat as fitting into the boxes that we have in our heads. Okay, so with that, we're going to talk about these aspects of identity a little bit more, and talk about what types of identities we see happening in the world. So first, sex assigned at birth, which is this spectrum we have up here. Each of these is its own spectrum. So for sex assigned at birth, we can have people who are assigned female at birth. We can have folks that are assigned male at birth. And again, this is typically based on primarily on external genitalia. But again, we know that there's a lot more that goes into physiological sex-connected characteristics, like internal genitalia, gonads, hormones, chromosomes, right? And there are a lot of human beings who are born intersex, meaning that their physiological traits don't all line up neatly in what we would consider the female box or the male box. So there are people born who have maybe external genitalia that a doctor would label as female, but they have testes, right? Which is something that we would typically label as male. And being born intersex is actually fairly common. So I believe it's something like 1 in 2,000 live births, which is about the rate of people being born with red hair. So if you think about the number of redheads that you know or have seen, right, it's just as common for folks to be born intersex. So we want to think about the concept of physiological sex characteristics as on a spectrum. You may have, this is another note about language here. You may have heard the sort of intersex characteristics be described as, or have a term used, use the term hermaphrodite to describe people who have a variety of physiological characteristics that don't fit into either all female described or male assigned. The term hermaphrodite is very outdated, and it's also been used in very harmful ways in the past. And so we discourage you from using the word hermaphrodite. It is typically going to be very triggering and harmful for folks. And intersex is the word we'll be using, and it's a best practice term to use. Now, of course, that all in individual situations, if you're actually talking to someone, you really want to use the words that they use to identify themselves. And so if somebody is using the word hermaphrodite for themselves, it may be a thing to have a conversation about, like, is this the word that you want me to use? But in general, intersex is the best practice term. So we've talked about sex assigned at birth. Now we're going to talk about something that is entirely separate. Each of these categories is separate from the others. We're going to talk about gender identity, which is not at all related to or connected to or determined by our sex assigned at birth. Gender identity is our inner sense of gender, right? In our gender unicorn, it lives in our head because it's inside of us. The terms that we use to talk about gender identity are woman and girl, or man and boy. And if someone does not identify or is not strictly a woman or a girl, or strictly a man or a boy, there's a lot of terms that are outside of that binary that we might use. In this non-binary part of the spectrum, which is quite broad, there's a lot of different words that folks might use. Non-binary is a very common term. A non-binary person doesn't identify with either end of this binary, either part of this binary. Other words are gender queer, gender fluid, gender expansive, and also folks who don't identify with gender at all, really. They just don't have an internal sense of gender. May use the term agender, meaning no gender. We also have words for this not being in the gender binary that are very culturally specific, that belong to and are used traditionally in specific cultural communities. For example, in many Native American communities, there's a role and a term, two-spirit, and that's just one example of one of these culturally specific terms that is used for people who don't fit within the gender expression or the gender role or the gender identity of man or woman. This is the term two-spirit is something that we want to be aware of. There are also a bunch of other culturally specific terms that it's good to be aware of, but we also want to acknowledge that these are culturally rooted, right? These are not words like non-binary that are really open or appropriate for use by everyone generally. And now we're going to look at the two ends of this binary. We have some additional language here. Cisgender and transgender are words that really are, they're all about these prefaces, these prefixes, right? So cis means on the same side of, and trans means to cross over. So if we have a cisgender woman, that is really referring to the fact that this woman's gender aligns with what traditionally, goes with or we would expect to align with that or be on the same side of the binary with a female sex assigned at birth. A transgender woman, and the same for a cisgender man or a cisgender boy. That prefix cis means on the same side of. So a cisgender man or boy would be assigned male at birth. A transgender man or boy is that. So trans means to cross over. Transgender is a word that's used by a lot of people, a lot of men who were assigned female at birth, but are a man or a boy. So for a transgender man, you could say a transgender man, or you could just say a man, right? Because if a man tells you that they're a man, then they're a man. The same with a transgender woman, right? Trans means to cross over. So a transgender woman is a woman, so you could just say a woman. But a transgender woman is, the trans part means to cross over and therefore likely male assigned at birth. The important thing to recognize, however, is that the gender identity that we're talking about is man or woman or non-binary. And the transgender piece is an optional adjective, right? If somebody describes themselves as transgender, then it's appropriate to use that word. If someone describes themselves as a woman, then that is the gender identity that we're going to talk about, right? And the other important thing to recognize, again, is that sex assigned at birth and gender identity are entirely separate concepts, and neither predicts or determines the other. Okay. I'm going to go through that. Okay. Finally, we're going to talk about concepts of gender expression and then the concept of sexual orientation. Again, gender expression is separate from gender identity. Gender expression is how we can choose to communicate our gender through how we talk, through what we wear, through our actions, through what we look like. And gender expression can also be and is a spectrum. So there are more feminine aspects of gender expression, more masculine aspects. And on the middle of the spectrum, we have expressions of gender that are gender nonconforming, that don't fall into what sort of society says is feminine, strictly feminine or strictly masculine. We also have sort of the concept of androgyny or androgynous gender expression, which is not not easily placed, not easily read or interpreted as either strictly feminine or strictly masculine. Gender expression is one of the most visible aspects of identity that we're going to be talking about. It's actually the only aspect of identity that is truly visible to the world without someone telling you what they're doing or what their identity is. And that means that gender expression is often misinterpreted as a way to guess someone's sexual orientation or to guess someone's gender, right? But there are a lot of reasons why someone might express their gender in a particular way. Someone might express their gender in traditionally masculine ways because they really connect to that, or because they want to be read as, in traditionally masculine ways for a context-specific reason, for their job, or because it's fun, or because they fear repercussions if they express themselves in a way that's not traditionally masculine. Same can go for traditional feminine expression. That can be a genuine expression of this is how I feel and I want to share it with the world. It can also be an expression of this is how I want you to see me because it's safer for me, or it's better for me, or that's just how I'm feeling today, or I'm having some fun, right? Our gender expression is what we say to the world. And there's a lot of different reasons that we're expressing our gender in different ways. And they don't necessarily connect to our gender identity or our sexual orientation. So. And finally, sexual orientation. So some terms that you'll hear and want to start practicing and using are straight, lesbian, and gay. And then, of course, we have a whole spectrum. So someone who identifies as or is straight, that means that they are typically means that they are attracted to the opposite gender, right? So if a straight man, typically that's going to indicate that it's likely that that man is attracted to women. Lesbian and gay are words that we use to talk about our identities when we're attracted to people of the same gender. So it's likely that if someone, a woman identifies as a lesbian, that woman is likely attracted to other women, and that's what she's trying to indicate by using the term lesbian. And then, of course, because all of these identities are on a spectrum, there are many, many patterns of attraction that fall outside of that binary, right? So bisexual, meaning that somebody is attracted to people of the same gender and also people of different gender. Pansexual, which means that someone can experience attraction to people of any gender just based on who that person is. And asexual, which means that someone doesn't experience sexual attraction, or maybe only experiences sexual attraction in specific circumstances. There's a lot more complexity to all of these terms, and I want to take a moment to really, really encourage you to try to get to one of our 6-hour trainings on this. There's a lot that we're not covering here. There's a lot of practice that it takes to get comfortable with these terms. And there's a lot of really important stuff that we want to talk about. It has to do with things like, how do you have conversations with people about their identity? When is it appropriate to do that? When should you ask for this information? When should you not? And how should you ask for this information? But we do want to leave you, or I want to leave you before I pass to Monica, with just a couple of best practices about managing information about a client's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Most important, disclosing or telling someone else about a client's or anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity without their permission can be harmful. It's not always going to be harmful, but it can be. There are a lot of really good reasons that people, particularly LGBTQIA+ people, want to really closely control the sharing of information about their identity and their experience. And we really need to respect that, because it can be an issue of comfort, and trust. It can also be an issue of safety. We understand that gathering information about SOGI is a continuing process, because people's sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression change, and also because people's what people want to share about their sexual orientation and gender identity can change. So it's important to not assume that the information someone put in HMIS 3 years ago is still current information about that client. And we always want to make sure that this information comes directly from the client themselves, and never ever based on our assumptions or based on hearsay or things that other people are telling us, because only that client and that human being can know what their sexual orientation or their gender identity is. So that is this is where I'm going to pass back to Monica. And I'm going to apologize first for going 4 minutes over on that, Monica, but we will still have time to cover all of our material and to take a break in a bit. So
no worries at all. Thanks, Eli. This is a ton of information. I want to invite folks to take a little stretch break while I kind of verbally transition us to the next bit of our training. Feel free to kind of look around the room, give your eyes a break from the screen for a moment. As Eli noted, we really front loaded kind of the densest part of the training because we wanted to make sure to really build a strong foundation. And so in this next segment to preview, we're going to really jam through what in the 6-hour version of the training is several different units. So we're going to kind of give you some of those key takeaways to round out this introduction before we move on to the equal access rule and practicing after our break. So we wanted to build a strong foundation with terminology and language because of the great impact that the language we use can have on the people that we work and build relationships with. So some terminology can convey bias. For example, referring to being part of the LGBTQIA+ community as a lifestyle or a choice, or perhaps insinuating that someone is so identifying because it's popular to do so. We really want to avoid using these terminologies that can convey that bias, and instead to create and maintain positive relationships with our clients. There are a few important things to note. We've said it before and we'll say it again multiple times before the training, but one of the key takeaways of today is to really not make assumptions. We want to ask for and use the pronouns that someone provides for us. We don't want to be reliant upon government issued identification to tell us what someone's name or gender is. We really want to be asking questions. And we can invite someone to share their name and pronoun with us by sharing ours at the outset. And some folks were doing that in the chat as they were introducing themselves. So for example, if I'm meeting someone, I could say, hi, my name is Monica. My pronouns are she, her. What is your name and what are your pronouns? Something as simple as that. When we're conducting intakes, we want to use inclusive and gender neutral language as much as possible. If it's relevant for us to know whether the person is in a relationship, rather than asking, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a husband or a wife, we could ask, do you have a partner or do you have a significant other or are you in a relationship? And also when we're addressing a group, rather than saying ladies and gentlemen or you guys, we could use more inclusive language like saying hello everyone, hello all, or y'all. And on the next slide, as we are learning this new terminology, it also comes with some new grammar lessons. And Eli was previewing some of this for us. So for example, if we have a client who wants to be referred to as transgender as part of their identity and how you relate with them, then you want to refer to the client, of course, in the way that they want to be referred to. But we would use the term transgender and not transgendered or a transgender. And that is inappropriate. There is no such thing as a transgender. The correct phrasing there would be a transgender man or a transgender woman or a transgender non-binary person. But we want to avoid things like using the term transgendered, as that is incorrect. Additionally, all the way at the bottom, we talked in some of those SOGI spectrum slides with Eli about sex assigned at birth. And that is the correct terminology there. We would not want to say something like somebody is physically X or biologically, or certainly not actually. Someone's gender identity is very different from their sex assigned at birth. And so we want to make sure that we're using correct terminology to convey our understanding of those differences. So we talked a little bit about pronouns. You may hear the phrase preferred pronoun. And it's important to keep in mind that someone's personal experience of their gender is not a choice or a preference. So if using the term preferred pronoun, that might leave someone feeling like you don't respect their gender experience as valid. So for example, my name is Monica and my pronouns are she, hers. That's not my preference, that's just what they are. And so if someone were to refer to me with a different name or different pronouns, I don't know that I'd really be able to establish a relationship of trust with that person because they're sort of disrespecting me in that way. So there's a number of different pronouns that you might encounter. She, her, hers, and ella, he, him, his, and elle. There are also additional pronouns that aren't even listed here. In addition to they, them, someone might use all pronouns, or they might not use any pronouns and be referred to by name only. So to illustrate this with a simple example, with the first set of pronouns, you might say, Kathy went to see the movie and she said it was good. If someone uses they, them, you could say, for example, Alex went to see the movie and they said it was good. Or if someone named Alex does not use pronouns or prefers name only, then we would say Alex went to see the movie and Alex said it was good. I want to note here that this is difficult. I probably even have been making mistakes during this training. I've certainly made mistakes in my learning process. But what we want to do is be as mindful as possible to not misgender someone and to be mindful in the event that we do. So to misgender would mean to refer to another person as a gender that they do not identify with. And this could be done unintentionally based on an assumption or forgetting, or sometimes it's done intentionally to cause emotional and psychological harm. And whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally, it can be harmful to clients and it can damage their relationship that you have with them. And so in the event that you do misgender someone, you want to quickly apologize. You want to correct and move on and practice for accuracy. You don't want to make it like this whole big thing. It's become this big dramatic moment. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Like really drawing attention to it. But you do want to acknowledge what you've done, quickly apologize and correct and move on. And then as much as possible to be practicing for accuracy. So even when you're talking about the client, when they're not there, you want to make sure that you're continuing to use their name and pronouns so that you're practicing so that when they are there, you're sure to use them correctly. So this is a lot so far. As we've noted, I want to pause here to note some key takeaways thus far. So everyone has a SOGI. Everyone has a sexual orientation, a gender identity, and a gender expression. Each part of our SOGI, each one of those spectrums that Eli went over with us, is distinct from one another, and no one of them automatically determines what another is going to be. It's really important for us to know this because language carries meaning and has an impact, even if it is unintentional. And we went over this really quickly, but it is really important. And we go into this more in our 6-hour training, which we will continue to plug. But we want to make sure to get permission from someone before disclosing their SOGI, because disclosing someone's SOGI without their permission can be harmful to them and their safety. So I want to pause here to see how we are doing so far. Let's do this with a quick scale of 1 to 5 in the chat. 5 being, I'm getting it and I'm ready to move on. 1 being, I'm lost and we need to go back. How are folks feeling so far? Okay, great. Great, thank you. And we are coming up on a break pretty soon. So please feel free to continue to let us know if you have any questions in the chat, or we'll be available during the break as well if folks want to maybe go into a breakout and ask a question privately. Great. So we are going to shift slightly to talk now about building on the importance of language and terminology. There are additional ways that we can create and maintain spaces that are affirming for our clients. And so I want to pause here to ask you all to maybe share in the chat, what kind of qualities make a place feel safe to you? So maybe visualize a place that you find safety or comfort. It might be a place related to the icebreaker, where we talked about things that have made us smile recently. But when we think about these places, what do they look like? Who is there or not there? What do you see? What do you hear? What are those places like? And this can be self-reflection, or you're welcome to share in the chat. Yeah, light can definitely be an aspect of it. Bright rooms. And the people who are there. Absolutely. Pardon me. People I trust, people who are nice, people who make me feel good. Absolutely. Positive sayings, calm language and demeanor. Fantastic. And Kathleen, that's a beautiful segue onto our next slide. And Anissa as well. So let's talk a little bit about some environmental cues and visual aids. So in the next slide, we have some examples about how to make a space affirming through visual aids. And Maestro, I think I'm not quite seeing the next slide just yet. Oh, there it is. Thank you so much. So here we have a number of different visual aids that could be used to make a space additionally welcoming or affirming. The first flag, so there are 5 circles across the top of the slide. Each of those circles is a different pride flag. The first one on the left is black, brown, and then the colors of the rainbow. This is the LGBTQ pride flag, and it incorporates black and brown stripes representing people of color in the LGBTQ community. The next flag has light blue, light pink, and white, and is the transgender pride flag. The flag in the middle is yellow with a purple circle, and that is the intersex pride flag. The fourth flag that has yellow, white, purple, and black stripes is the non-binary pride flag. And finally, on the right, the flag that has black, gray, white, and purple stripes is the asexual pride flag. These are not the only pride flags. I didn't know this until I was researching for this presentation, but there are at least 21 different flags. And the flag in the middle bottom is Valentino Vecchietti's 2021 redesign of the Progress Pride flag, which incorporates the intersex flag into the chevron, as well as the transgender pride flag and the black and brown stripes to represent people of color in the community. I'm going to add a couple of resources in the chat here for some more information and how to get some signage with reduced printing costs available in case you are in a physical space where you'd like to add some of these signs. And additionally, of course, having additional signage, brave space, this space is welcoming for everyone, or having all gender restroom signs are additional ways to set up those spaces. And on the next slide, we want to talk about how environmental cues alone, of course, do not create affirming spaces. Our behaviors need to support and reinforce them in order to ensure that our clients feel safe and welcome. We can either do that proactively or in the way that we respond to situations that arise. So in the event of harassment, for example, we want to make sure that we are addressing it head on and not responding with blaming or excluding. So for example, if someone is being harassed due to the way that they're dressed, we don't want to say something like, well, if you didn't dress like that, no one would bother you, because that would be blaming someone for the harassment that they are experiencing instead of addressing that harassment and making it stop. It could also be exclusive to exclude someone from programming or services because you don't have appropriate resources you can refer them to, or by implicitly excluding someone, maybe based on your own assumption about where the person might feel most comfortable. Again, we really don't want to be making assumptions, and we want to be asking folks what the best resources and services are for them. As I noted, in the event of harassment, we definitely want to make sure that we are intervening. And I'm going to talk in a moment about how to do that. And we want to engage in actively accepting behaviors by supporting and advocating for our clients. We do recognize, we want to be realistic, that as much as we can set up spaces that are affirming, there are situations that are going to happen. Somebody's going to say something, conflict is going to arise. And so we want to help you to be prepared. And so the last thing we'll do before going to the break is talk about a couple of different scenarios and frameworks for how to respond. So in the first framework, we want to talk about in the event of what I'm going to call an appropriate question or a comment. And how can I tell that something is appropriate? Sometimes you can tell based on the words that are being used, and sometimes you can tell based on the tone or the intentionality. If somebody is coming to you with a question because they are truly coming with curiosity, then that's something that you want to encourage. I'll talk in a moment, though, about if somebody is coming at you with a different kind of energy. But say here, for example, we are in a facility that provides sleeping arrangements, and a client comes to us and says, why does Angel, who is transgender, get to have their own room, whereas I have a roommate? That question, let's assume, is coming to us with curiosity. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to validate the good. It's a good thing that people are coming to us with questions for a couple of reasons. One, they're asking and not assuming. Two, they're coming to us as the staff people rather than going to the client, which might be more uncomfortable. And they're coming to us with curiosity instead of like with anger and resentment. And so we want to thank someone for coming to us with a question. And then the next thing we want to do is clarify what they're asking about. Again, the big bumper sticker of this training is to not assume. We might think that we know why they're asking that question, and we might be right, but we might be surprised. And so before we answer the question, we really want to understand what the underlying concern is. So clarifying what they're asking about, maybe if they used a term and you're not sure what they meant by that term, asking them to tell you a little bit more information about why they've brought that question or that comment forward. And then the real bulk of the conversation, and it still might be a quick one, but the important step here is to educate and inform as best you can. This might include dispelling myths or sharing resources. And of course, we want to be sure to be using language that is age appropriate. We might speak to a youth differently than how we'd speak to an adult. Also, we want to be cognizant of the person's native language. So we might speak to someone if their native language is in English versus if their native language is one that we don't speak. And so we're wanting to make sure that we're using words that folks are understanding so that we're really able to connect and answer those questions and concerns. This might be a nonlinear process. We might have to bump back up to clarifying, but we want to make sure that before we wrap up the conversation, we end by encouraging them to return to us if they have any further questions or if they want to talk more. We're going to have an opportunity to revisit this framework in the second half of our training, but yeah, Jan, that's a really great point about knowing proper terms to use in Spanish. So I think that would be something great that we can crowdsource maybe in our breakouts when we're going through these frameworks. That's a really great point. Thank you. So for the first framework, we are clarifying, educating, and informing. We're validating the good, then we clarify, educate and inform, and then encourage. And the last slide we'll go over here before the break is talking about the framework for opportunities to intervene. And this is in a scenario where someone comes to us with an inappropriate comment or an insult. So for example, we might be able to tell because they have used a slur or a term. It might also be inappropriate based on their tone or the intentionality that we can tell that they're bringing to the question or the comment or the insult. So for example, if someone was to say, the way Barry was dressed today was really weird. That's not a curious statement, that's a judgmental statement. And so that's where we want to shift into this intervention framework. And so here, the very first step is to intervene. We need to do this immediately and use our skills to be allies. So you might even be able to do this by saying, hey, something was said that just caught my attention. I want to pause here to note that this is still a 4-step framework. It's not just, hey, that's wrong, because that might escalate the situation, that might lead to further harassment with the client. What we want to do with this framework is explain why it's wrong so that it doesn't happen again. So once we've intervened, we've hit pause on whatever is going on, we're going to name the bias and the hurt. You'll recall in the first framework that the second step was to clarify. That's similar in this framework as well, except in this instance, we're the ones who are doing the clarification. With age appropriate and language appropriate terminology, we are explaining why what was said was inappropriate. Also, if something was said to the general room or in a group, then we want to make a general statement to the room rather than honing in on the speaker. Because again, our goal is not to escalate the situation. Our goal is to diffuse the situation and explain it so that it doesn't happen again. Similar to the first framework, the third step is educating and inform. Here we're explaining why that comment was inappropriate. And then again, our fourth and final step is looking forward. So in the first framework, we were saying, hey, come to me again if you have any further questions. Here we're saying, don't do it again. Looking forward, I don't want to hear that term anymore. We don't want to be vague. We need to be concrete about why the comment was inappropriate. And again, if we certainly defer to your judgment as professionals in terms of, in the particular situation, it might be best to pull the person aside, or it might be best to have a conversation with the general group. But in the event that you've worked with the person on the side, if you know that anybody else in the space heard it, they just heard the inappropriate thing and they didn't hear the resolution. So you want to make sure that anybody who heard the inappropriate thing is also hearing that resolution and that reassurance that a conversation happened and this isn't going to be happening again. So that was a whole lot. I want to pause here to see if there's any questions at all. Let's go ahead and use the 1 through 5 again, because that was helpful. 5 is, I'm feeling okay. 1 is, I've got some questions, we need to go back. And yeah, you can use the fingers or you can show us in the chat. Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being with us for the first half of our training. We're going to go ahead and take our 5-minute break now. So we will come back at 10:38. And feel free to shoot us a direct message or hang out if you have any questions you'd like to ask during the break. We can go ahead and pause the recording, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to the equal access rule and to the really fairly clear expectations and requirements, compliance requirements that relate to equal access regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. We're going to start here with, I think, what is what is truly the most important piece of the policy and the rules aspect of this. And that is our community's commitment to equal access. Because the Santa Clara County system of care as a community has expressed a commitment to equal access long before the federal government created its compliance requirements. There's a long-standing commitment that's written into Santa Clara countywide quality assurance standards, which are a set of local policies that are there that apply to many of the programs in our community, that were developed by our community and that clearly establish a commitment to equal access, that require that all agencies have non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies and procedures, and that mandate equal access to things like restrooms, shelter, and housing, right? So this is a community priority. It is also a federal requirement. And knowing the federal requirements can be useful, A, so that you can be compliant in your project, and B, because they can be useful tools in pushing back against any resistance or reluctance to implementing some of these best practices. The specific rule that most of what we're going to cover comes from is the rule called the Equal Access in Accordance with an Individual's Gender Identity in Community Planning and Development Programs Final Rule. There are several different equal access rules and notices that expand on these concepts, but the primary things we're going to talk about come from this September 16th rule. We're just going to talk about all of these compliance aspects as the equal access rule, or just equal access for short. Who does the equal access rule apply to? Who really actually has to follow and comply with these rules strictly in order to comply with grant requirements? Pretty much basically all recipients or subrecipients, anybody who's getting funding from a community planning and development program. So CPD is a HUD office, the Office of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. What might be more familiar to you is these individual grant program names. So the Continuum of Care Program, Emergency Solutions Grant Program, HOPWA, HOME, CDBG, all of these funding streams come with the equal access rule requirements. Even if your project is not funded by one of these funding streams, I think can be really useful to understand these federal requirements because they are actually pretty good practice. They're pretty good rules. And it can be, again, a useful tool to say, hey, I know we don't have to comply with this, but this is what HUD says is best practice. This is accepted national practice in this area. So we're going to go over 3 key points from the equal access rule. One, HUD clarifies that gender identity is self-identified, right? Gender identity is the identity that someone says that they have, right? Because a person knows best about their own identity. And specifically, HUD says that gender identity is not defined by, is separate from a person's legal gender markers or identity documents. Second, the rule explicitly prohibits intrusive questioning and requests for documentation to back up someone's gender identity, what they tell you their gender identity is. And finally, the rule, of course, requires updates to written policies and procedures. The written policies and procedures is a part that I think can be overlooked and can be forgotten, but it's important both for compliance reasons and also because, people move on. Human beings find other jobs, they retire, they move on to do other things with their lives. Written policies and procedures are one of the ways that we ensure that an agency, an organization maintains a consistent approach over time, right? So we're protecting our current clients and also our future clients by having policy procedures. So now we're going to dig into each of these 3 requirements a little bit more. First, the equal access rule says that gender identity is self-determined. We talked about this in our best practice section, right? Someone's gender identity lives in their heart and in their brain. HUD agrees with this, and their specific definition, the things that they define are gender identity. So whenever HUD uses the term gender or gender identity, they mean the gender with which a person identifies regardless of the sex assigned to that person at birth and regardless of the person's perceived gender identity. So then what does HUD mean by perceived gender identity? They define perceived gender identity as, quote, the gender with which a person is perceived to identify based on that person's appearance, behavior, expression, other gender-related characteristics, or sex assigned to the individual at birth, or identified in documents. So putting this together, what is HUD saying to us? What is HUD telling us? They're saying when HUD is talking about gender, when we're telling you to record someone's gender in HMIS, or when you're doing an assignment of a shelter bed, or showing someone a bathroom, or providing other services that are allowed to be gender or sex segregated, what is the person's gender? They're saying the person's gender is what they say it is, the gender with which they identify. And if you look at a person, or you look at their ID documentation, or what you see or you hear something about that person, and you assume that their gender is X, that is irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter what it says in their identity documents. All it matters for HUD purposes is what they identify their gender as. Great question in the chat. If someone has had their rights violated, for example, has been denied housing because their gender did not match their identity documents, what is the recourse? I am going to give Monica a few minutes to think about that question, but ask her to try to take that one. And when we pass over, Monica, would you mind trying to give some suggestions about that? She's got it in the chat. Excellent. So it looks like, oh yeah. So this that would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act and of the Equal Access Rule. The Fair Housing Act is a little more broadly applicable than the Equal Access Rule, but there are mechanisms for filing complaints. This would also be something where it might be helpful to reach out to one of the legal service providers, because this would be housing discrimination. And Monica will tell me if that's not correct. Okay. So the next aspect, and thank you for the question, Jen. The next aspect of the Equal Access Rule is that intrusive questioning is explicitly prohibited. So what does that mean? In a lot of situations, you may be required by compliance rules to ask about a person's gender, right? It's a required element in HMIS. You should be asking as a data collection practice about someone's gender if you're an HMIS participating organization. But what you must not do, what you may not do, is ask further intrusive questions about a person's gender identity, including you may not ask for any evidence, any documentation, any physical evidence, any medical evidence to support someone's gender identity. You may not ask about anatomical information. You may not ask about what their body looks like. And you may not ask for or about their medical or physical history. So when we're collecting data or asking someone about their gender identity, we're only asking about their gender identity, which is self-defined. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pass over to Monica, but actually I'm going to pause here and see, are there any questions about these two aspects of the rules? Any questions coming up for you about how to implement these, how to apply them? Oops, here we go. So far. Okay, Monica, take it away.
Great, thanks, Eli. So Eli's talked to us about the first two of three prongs under the equal access rule, that gender identity is self-determined and intrusive questioning is prohibited. The third and final key point from the equal access rule is regarding policies and procedures. All programs must have written policies and procedures that ensure equal access for all individuals and their families accessing or applying to access the program, that provide housing, services, and accommodations in accordance with all clients' gender identities, and that determine eligibility without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. And again, as Eli noted, these are really important to have in writing to set expectations for staff and clients, especially through staff turnover. It also provides institutional guidance so that everyone is on the same page. And if an issue arises more than once, that issue is dealt with consistently. And it sets a tone and a message of inclusion. So now that we've covered the three key points of the equal access rule, let's talk about how to apply the equal access rule to the context that we face in our work. The first context is facilities with shared sleeping and bathing areas. And for these, placements must be made based on an individual's gender identity as they report it to you. We, as providers, need to take any non-discriminatory steps that are necessary and appropriate in the event that there are any privacy concerns raised by residents, and facility admissions, occupancy, and operating policies need to be updated periodically to ensure compliance. So to unpack that second bullet point a little bit more, non-discriminatory means that we're taking measures that do not impact an LGBTQIA+ person's access or experience of the program. So for example, if a transgender man comes to you and says that he feels uncomfortable showering in the congregate bathroom that has no stalls or curtains, we wouldn't want to react such as to isolate that person or segregate them. Instead, we want to change the space itself. So here, an appropriate response would be to make changes to the showering area for everyone to ensure greater privacy, such as hanging curtains or other dividers. It would not be to ask this man to shower at a different time or in a different place from everyone else so as to segregate him. Another example, say there's men's and women's multi-stall bathrooms and a single stall bathroom. If a client is uncomfortable, again, we want to be asking what is the basis of that discomfort and what might make them feel more comfortable, and allow them to have options, which could include but should not be limited to using that single stall bathroom or using the bathroom at a different time. And again, as a reminder, we want to have these policies and procedures in writing so that staff know how to address any of these concerns as they come up, because we can anticipate the kinds of questions and concerns that might come up. So we want to provide that guidance. The second scenario, to kind of back up to outreach and engagement and assessment. So here equal access means to accept the name and gender given by the individual, to use the pronoun as indicated by the individual. And again, if identification is required, we want to use the individual's current name and gender identity as they report it to us, not necessarily based on the government issued identification. So this allows someone to feel more comfortable and to continue in the outreach and engagement and assessment process. If someone is feeling respected, they might give us some important information that will assist us in finding the right services for them. But if we drop the ball right at name, which is the very first question, by the time we get to the end of the assessment, they're probably not going to be giving us really critical information so that we can support them. So we really need to be building that trust and that rapport at the outset with that mutual respect. As we move on from outreach, engagement, and assessment to enrollment on the next slide, equal access means providing a confidential area to talk about services that the client may want to access and ensure a confidential space for those conversations. It means not asking intrusive questioning, as Eli noted. We don't need to know the client's sex assigned at birth in most cases during the intake process. It might be relevant if the person wants to seek gender affirming care or to change their government issued ID. But unless it's relevant and the client self-identifies that it's relevant, we don't need to be asking these intrusive questions. And again, if we have a project that is specific to a certain gender or genders, we want to accept the client whose gender, even if their gender expression doesn't necessarily fit the stereotypical gender expression, because again, gender expression is separate from and distinct from gender identity. So we want to be keeping those things in mind. It would not be in accordance with the equal access rule to turn a potential client away based on their gender expression. So we're going through a bunch of these here. We've got a couple of more. Feel free to, of course, let us know in the chat if you have any questions. We're going to jam right on through, but I'm happy to pause if there's any questions in the chat. Oh, okay. Kevin, can you tell me a little bit more about the question? Does that mean the client identifies differently? So if a client's gender identity is separate from a parent's gender identity? Oh, if the parent doesn't agree, great question. Okay, so if the child's gender identity is different from what the parent doesn't recognize the child's gender identity. That is a great question. So the best practice would be to serve every client, including children, in accordance with their self-reported gender identity. I'm curious, though, if there are any particular circumstances, such as in the event of depending on age. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to talk through a couple of ways, and I would love to hear from folks in the chat about experiences they've had and ways they've dealt with it. But I think just some things to think about are the age of the child, for sure. Not so much in, you have to be older in order to know who you are, but the age of the child is really going to impact the options for the child and how you're going to talk with the child and potentially with the parents about this. Also, again, I would echo what Monica said, that you really want to stay rooted in what is the child asking you to do? Like, what is the child asking you to use different pronouns from what their parents are willing to use? The child asking you to use a different name? Is the child asking you, or are they interested in having you advocate for them with their parents or with other services or programs that they're participating in with their school? Or is the child just asking you to be there as a person that they know will support and affirm them? What feels safe to the child in terms of addressing this with the parent? And that said, if a child is asking you to help them, right, advocate effectively with their parents, or if they're saying, I can't educate my parents, can you try? Or if they're asking for something in particular, then it is a good, supportive, affirming thing to be able to help do that, right? Of course, within professional boundaries that are important to maintain for you, but being able to have materials, education for family members, for schools if they're not on board or if they're behind in their education, and being able to have conversations about things that we've talked about, like a person's gender identity is sort of deeply rooted in them, and things like the gender identity and gender expression are sort of come into play really early in a child's development. This is not something that is a fad or a phase. Do that kind of education to help support the child, but always coming back to what is the child asking for and what feels safe for them. Monica, any comments on that?
Thank you. That was great. Absolutely. And yeah, also, of course, we're very interested in other folks' experiences with these and your expertise in working through these scenarios in real time. We've got some additional training resources that we're happy to provide in terms of working with youth and their parents. So really appreciate folks for flagging these questions, and we'll be sure to include those in our follow-up email along with the slides.
And just a quick plug for the 6-hour training. The materials in the 6-hour training have more opportunities to talk about this. There also, a lot of it is based, was created originally by the RISE Center, or the RISE program out of the LA Pride Center, and were originally developed to focus on youth. And so we do, as Monica said, have a lot of materials attached to that 6-hour training that deal with children and advocacy for children.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks again to folks for these great questions. Just a couple more slides, and then we're going to hop into some breakouts to work through some of these scenarios together. And so here, equal access in unit and bed assignment means that we're providing confidential space as always, and really following those intervention frameworks that we talked through in the first half of the training. We want to be sure to model respect and coach clients in the event of disrespect, and to quickly resolve any conflicts, including having an internal policy and procedure that helps us to identify whether harassment has reached the level where we might expel a client from the program. And finally here, equal access and ongoing service provision means to recognize every client's right to access all services for which they're eligible, correcting any client misperceptions regarding safety risks. And we go into this much more in the longer training, but really ensuring that all clients understand that physical and verbal bullying are not tolerated. Because here, to ensure truly equal and safe access to housing and services, that means building this cultural competency and anti-discrimination into our organizational culture. And so here in the last bullet, for example, we want to have those written policies and procedures. We want to train staff and continue to supervise and manage staff as these issues come up. We want to communicate and clarify these expectations and make sure that we're really maintaining these spaces. So we're so glad to still have you with us. I'm going to turn it over to Eli to introduce our activity that'll give us a chance to put our lessons into practice.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. So we're going to have a practice activity, and I'll walk you through how this is going to go. Because we have a lovely large group here, we're actually going to split into two. So I will be taking one group in a breakout room, and Monica will be taking the other group in a breakout room. And we'll be talking about, each group will talk about a different set of scenarios. We'll give you a hypothetical scenario with a client, and we'll walk through some discussion questions about how would we deal with this particular situation. We'll call back to those frameworks for addressing comments and questions, or addressing inappropriate comments, and we'll work through it together. For my breakout group, we did some really excellent work, and I know we didn't get to answer the last question fully, but it's a great start. And I hope that that was a little bit helpful in getting into like, how does this apply? And I'm really excited to hear from Monica's breakout group as well. So Monica, do you want to start the share out?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll be mindful of the time so that we're sure to both have a chance. So our group worked through a hypothetical where we are working in a shelter, and we heard a client say to another client, that a client shouldn't be allowed to stay in my room because she's not even a girl. And so we talked through the opportunities to intervene framework in response to that bias statement. We talked about the possibility of waiting to see how the other client responds versus intervening immediately. Naming the bias statement, which is she's not even a girl. That was a bias statement, and explaining why that is biased. To educate and inform the speaker about some of the terminology that we've been learning today about SOGI and the differences between sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and asking for change to not be repeating statements that are laden with bias in our workspace. As the hypothetical goes on, we learn that the client who made that statement has experienced past trauma and does not feel comfortable rooming with a transgender woman. And so here we shifted based on that new information that we have to the opportunities to educate framework. So we want to thank the client for coming to us and sharing that sensitive experience. We want to clarify a little bit more their concerns about safety. And then here, and we're on the second slide for it, we want to be educating and informing, and there's a number of ways to do that. We can remind the client of our shelter's policies and procedures in place to maintain all client safety. And we can also correct some misinformation that the client might have. Indeed, members of the LGBTQIA plus community statistically are much more likely to be the targets of violence rather than the perpetrators. And any part of an individual's SOGI does not necessarily indicate how that person is going to interact with anyone else. And so making sure that all of the clients feel safe in this space. And finally, in accordance with the equal access rule, if this is a conflict that cannot be resolved or a discomfort that cannot be worked through, that the client who should be moved in that instance is the speaker, the person who raised the conflict, and not the neutral person who's fine with the room assignment. How are things in your group, Eli?
Thanks, Monica. I will share. So our hypothetical was in a shelter setting, and one of our colleagues, Kevin, did an intake with a new client, Jay. Jay identified their gender as non-binary in response to an HMIS data collection question, and Kevin wasn't familiar with that term, was confused by the response, and as a result asked Jay for their driver's license, which did have a female gender marker. And Kevin proceeded to listen to the driver's license and as opposed to Jay, and entered Jay into HMIS as female, used a set of pronouns that were inaccurate when introducing Jay to other staff members, and showed Jay the women's restroom. So what could Kevin have done differently? Get a clarification, right? We talked about you can ask what non-binary language means. We talked about, maybe it's appropriate to ask Jay in that moment, but it's not strictly necessary. Kevin could have moved forward and noted, I need to ask what non-binary means really quickly after I'm done with this part of the intake with Jay, and go get clarification from other staff or from other sources of education. Don't assume is something Kevin should have done differently. Don't assume based on the driver's license, and listen to what a person says. Ask how Jay identifies and actually listen to that. Ask how Jay would like to be referred to, and ask what pronouns to use, right? It seems like Kevin could really benefit from our 6-hour SOGI training to be a little bit more comfortable with how to ask those questions and with some of the language and terminology. And then we talked about, I really love this idea from some of our folks, include all bathrooms in a tour, right? That's an easy way to make sure you're not restricting someone to something that is uncomfortable or unsafe for them. And then really quickly, finally, we talked about how do you respond to Jay and how do you address their concerns? So I loved the first, validate Jay's concerns. Thank you. I can take action. I can work with you on this. I understand why this is a concern. Ask Jay what they want us to do as the staff member, right? Do you want me to talk to Kevin with you or talk to Kevin for you? Do you want me to take other actions? These are some of the stuff I can do, and make sure that we're on the same page with Jay about what they're comfortable with sharing about their identity and what they're comfortable with us doing for them or with them. So thank you all so much for joining us for this training today. We're going to wrap up with, so we did our debrief. We're going to wrap up just with a thank you and a request that you please give us your feedback. Monica just posted the link to the feedback survey for this training. We really, really appreciate if you could click on that right now, open it up, and maybe fill it out in the couple of minutes after the training. I'll give you another reminder before we close up entirely. We also want to say, I think you can guess what's coming. We really, really encourage you, again, to find and set aside the time to take the 6-hour SOGI training. We're not just saying that because we love your faces and we like to see you and hang out with you. It's a really well put together training, which again, I can say because it was developed by the RISE program at the LA Pride Center. And it really gets into ways to practice, ways to become more comfortable. It's a lot more exposure to language, and also we give a lot of resources, but also give context to those resources. So we think it's a really good foundation for continuing learning and growth in this area. This training was a lot more focused on the equal access rule itself, and we gave you just a brief intro to set you up for that. But we really are hoping that every single provider in Santa Clara County can come to one of the 6-hour trainings, and we're providing them fairly frequently. So it's a monthly offering until we get everybody trained for the foreseeable future. Monica, anything to add?
Just thank you all again so much for your time and for your really great participation today. We really appreciate it and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Excellent. And if you have any questions about this topic, Monica and I are here. You can email Santa Clara COC at homebaseccc.org. It's on the slide. We're here for you all year round for this and any other topic.